Again, thank you from our side, Justice, for the invitation you extended to the Democratic Alliance. And yes, in line with your direction, we will in these oral submissions attempt to not repeat all of the arguments we made in our written submissions, but will rather aim to assist with some arguments that will deal with the mountain of information that has been placed before you, both in written format and during the course of this week. And we will make some arguments on the issues that you have identified in your engagements with others this week, and which then seems to be pertinent to your inquiry. So with this in mind, Justice, at the outset, we want to acknowledge the manner in which you have expressed and showcased this week an appreciation of the competing rights and interests that are in play during the course of this inquiry. Now, we did not deal in detail in our written submissions with the likely future trajectory of the infection rate that is at the heart of the pandemic, and we still do not profess to hold any scientific knowledge, being a political party, or any expertise which could assist you to make a definitive finding on what the state of play would be in respect of this pandemic from now until 27 October. And it has become very clear in listening to the oral submissions and reading through the written submissions on the website that scientists are not unanimous in the conclusions they have reached based on the available data as to what the virus is likely to do in the months to come and the risks it will pose from now until 27 October. Our reading is that scientists tend to generally hold the view that if the cyclical nature of the pandemic, as has been shown up to now, continues from now until October, that the rate of infections could in all likelihood be towards the lower end of the scale in the 2 months immediately prior to and on election day. This much was said by most of those who presented this week, although it must immediately be acknowledged that this is based on forecasts and was not said with absolute certainty. Some have even pointed out the possibility of further mutations of the virus, which might cause an earlier fourth wave. And the only expert which used the term likely in sharing and talking about this forecast was Professor Karim yesterday. Justice, you have used the term the sweet spot this week in reference to what I think we can describe as the ideal time to hold the elections amidst the pandemic. And we have formed the distinct impression from your interactions with other parties that up to yesterday you leaned on the basis of the evidence of some scientists to a position that more or less would be of the following nature, that for us, in order for us to save lives, we should consider waiting with elections until we have reached herd or community immunity through vaccination. We, however, submit that the difficulty with this is that there seems to be, firstly, some uncertainty as to whether we can say there is a likelihood that this community immunity will be reached on a more or less discernible and specific date. Some have said that on the basis of the current vaccine rollout plans of government, we will reach this by February next year. But then we heard Professor Karim yesterday say, but that data is a bit outdated and it's all likely that will be a month or two later. On this score, we argue, Justice, and that it's not for political reasons, that surely in order for us in this inquiry to place reliance on the future rollout of the vaccination program, one must consider the track record of government up to now in the rollout. And this poses a great difficulty. Very little of what government has promised us up to now regarding the rollout of the vaccine program, in as far as it relates to the targeted number of people to be vaccinated on a daily basis, has materialized. So therefore, we must ask ourselves whether it will be reasonable to accept that the target, the forecast of 40 million of us being vaccinated by February can be reasonably accepted. If one adds to this the possibility, Justice, and Professor Karim even said it, he deems it a probability, a likelihood of further mutations of the virus, which will become present before the target date for community immunity through vaccination, and which could render the protection given by the vaccines we receive in this country useless, then this possibility of community immunity on the back of vaccinations becomes, in our submission, even more remote. So we submit that if all of the submissions by the scientists are taken into account, the only three things that can be concluded by this inquiry are the following. One, that this pandemic is not going away anytime soon. Two, that while it's very difficult to predict the further trajectory of the pandemic, the most likely path from now until October shows a likelihood of us finding ourselves in the break between the third and a possible fourth wave, which would of course be optimal for campaigning and voting. And three, that the one element of our traditional way of life as human beings and as South Africans that should be avoided in order to best manage the pandemic is the mass gathering of people in close proximity to one another. Now we accept that all of us, Justice, who participate in this process are deeply committed to the protection of the right to life and health, which South Africans enjoy, and you've made put quite an emphasis on it in your engagements with others. And we accept that this issue will weigh heavily on your mind in making your determinations, specifically given the forceful testimony given by Dr. Farid Abdullah, which effectively said that if this election continues in the absence of community immunity, the lives of thousands of South Africans will be put at risk. So we're of course very hesitant to disagree with such a forceful statement, but we feel it's important to place reliance on it only as far as it is properly contextualized and as far as it's not contested by other experts who appeared here and gave their insights, as well as one further consideration we will argue just now. So firstly, Justice, it's in our view important to remember that this advice by Dr. Abdullah is to be contextualized by the fact that the reference to the election potentially exposing us to increased loss of life was primarily based, if one listened carefully to his submission, on an assumption that mass gatherings will invariably form part of the campaign period. Now, we will later on deal in some more detail with the issue of mass gatherings, but for now, I think it's suffice to say that we believe that a total prohibition on mass gatherings will have to be in place and will be in place from now until the election. Secondly, we have the strong evidence of Professor Karim, who testified that what should happen in all instances, given and in the midst of this pandemic, is to manage the pandemic with what he called the toolkit that is available to do so, and his conviction that it should be possible to have elections in a safe way in October. Now, on this score, Justice, we submit that the protocol that the IEC has used successfully during the by-elections that have taken place since the start of the state of the disaster is that very toolkit. We submit that this protocol is not only enabled the IEC to test whether its own risk measures could be successful, in the sense that the participation rate of voters would have to show trust and confidence in the IEC's ability to hold elections while not unduly exposing voters to infection, but also to test whether on an objective basis these elections did expose voters in an undue manner to the risk of infection. So what have these by-elections showed us? The turnout on average, as we have showed in our written submissions, compared very favorably to the by-elections that were held in the same period before the previous general local government elections. It was less than 4% lower in this current set of by-elections than in the by-elections in the similar period before the 2016 general local government elections. Now, we submit that this showed that voter confidence in the possibility of safe elections amidst the pandemic is real and in place. In addition, the interesting further unique aspect of the sample that is provided by these by-elections is, of course, that they were held in very clearly demarcated geographical areas, wards. Therefore, Justice, we submit that any scientists that had an interest in analyzing the impact on the likely trajectory caused by by-elections in the best possible local context could have and should have looked into whether we had higher rates of infection in these wards after these by-elections. Now, from where we are looking at it, we want to submit that if we had the so-called bushfires, which is the term government used at the beginning of the pandemic to describe smaller localized spikes in infection in these wards, then we would surely have been alerted to this by health officials And of course, it would have been a relevant local context to any argument that elections and voting, in terms of the IEC protocol, exposes South Africans in an undue manner to higher risk of infection. So we submit that while we hold no specific scientific expertise, this is the type of local context that should be factored into the equation, in our view, before final reliance can be placed on those who say this election cannot be held safely. We say this, Justice, specifically in light of the guidance the Constitutional Court has given in the Calm judgment, which says that the investigation into the freeness and fairness of elections should be done in context. And we submit that it goes without saying that the pandemic and the success of the measures introduced by the IEC to minimize the risk of infection is an essential part of our context. So while we are on the point of measures to ensure that voters are not exposed in an undue manner to risk of infection, we confirm, Justice, as we did in our written submissions, that we are of the opinion that the one further measure that could be considered is to allow for those with comorbidities and over the age of 50 years to cast special votes on the day before the main voting day. This Tuesday, the 26th of October, will in any event, in terms of the ordinary arrangements of the Commission, be used for special votes at voting stations. Therefore, to use this special voting day to accommodate bigger numbers than in the past can enable some spreading out of voters and help to further minimize the risk of infection. This will also address some of the other problems that could be caused by extending voting days and having 4 days of voting, which you have already taken note of this week. Issues around the safe storage of ballots and even the financial burden which will be placed on the public purse and the Commission if we add more than the ordinary 3 days of voting to this election. This brings me, Justice, to the other elements of free and fair elections that are in play. Firstly, the arguments around the role of mass gathering in elections. We submit that if we cut to the bone on this issue, it's quite clear that the danger mass gatherings hold for a significant increase in the rate of infections is quite possibly the one issue all scientists agree on. Therefore, it must be accepted that this will have to be a non-negotiable element of the campaign period if we are to have safe elections. If we circle back to the contextual investigation that the Constitutional Court said we are to use in South Africa to assess the freeness and fairness of elections, we submit that given that there is scientific agreement that mass gatherings is a no-no, if we are successfully going to manage the pandemic, and given that this limitation will apply to everyone, it cannot be argued on a conceptual level that this prohibition can render elections not free and fair in the context of the health pandemic on its own. If we then turn to the potential impact of the prohibition on mass gatherings on the ability of voters to make informed decisions on voting day, we stand by our written submission that it cannot be reasonably argued that mass gatherings are essential to achieving a properly informed electorate. It's only one of an ever-growing number of platforms and tools, the remainder of which will remain available to all parties and candidates in some way or form. We have noted with interest the debate during these oral submissions around the effective ability of poorer South Africans to access online information for the purpose of familiarizing themselves with the offer of different parties and candidates. Now, on this score, we believe 2 things are important. The first is the proposal by Media Monitoring South Africa that to address this issue, it should be facilitated that what they call public interest sites should be 0 rated for the campaign period, and their confirmation that 0 rating of some sites carrying information on the pandemic was achieved in a fairly efficient and fast and effective manner at the start of the pandemic, which shows this can still be done in time for it to add value towards the elections. The second thing that is important, Justice, in our view, is that it should be remembered that those who do not have effective access to online sources and resources make use in a greater way of radio and television for information. So we've noted you will be meeting with ICASA this evening and with this afternoon, and we think it will be vital. And as we have pointed out, the levels of penetration and the typical amount of time which radio listeners spend listening to radio programming And the amount of South Africans regularly watching television, and specifically the public broadcaster, the SABC, clearly indicate that the overwhelming majority of potential voters will not be precluded from accessing information on the policy proposals of political parties and candidates if they do not have unfettered access to online information. This brings me to a further point, Justice, and that's the argument which some have already made and others surely later today when you meet with other political parties will make, and that is that while it may be so that lockdown regulations will in all probability be eased in the weeks to come after the third wave has passed, the current level 4 regulations makes it very difficult to the point of impossible for parties to do the necessary to identify their candidates for election. Now, we have pointed out in our written submissions that all parties were informed by the IEC that it was of the intention to proceed with the preparations for this year's election towards the end of last week in April. And in early May, a draft timetable was published, which if anybody up to that point still claimed that they firmly believed no election was going to take place, should have been allowed voice to remind them that if they were of the intention to take part, they should get their ducks in a row. So that gave all of us about 6 to 7 weeks to tend to candidate selection before level 4 was announced last Sunday. Now, just as a basic analysis of the things these parties who will now be complaining that the regulations prevent them from selecting candidates busy themselves with since the end of April up to last weekend will show that they rather use their time and energy in that time for other things. Some of their activities like rallies and marches and court cases were well documented by the media. So we must say that we could not agree more with Ms. Solo of the Abacha Force for Change when she said on this issue that these parties should not complain now. They should have spent the time and money that went into those activities to rather have dealt with candidate selection. So we say if there's urgency now, Justice, it is largely self-created. But also in our view, it can be argued that these candidate selection meetings are rather the business meetings of political parties and not the type of political gatherings which the regulations prohibit. If one, in our view, looks carefully at the current regulations, it has put a temporary stop to political gatherings in which we as political parties would engage potential voters. Our own internal business meetings has not been prohibited by these regulations in our view. Justice, in conclusion, we deem it important to reflect somewhat on the task of this inquiry and the options available to it when it makes findings in the weeks to come. Now, firstly, we submit that a purposive and contextual interpretation of Section 14.4 of the Electoral Commission Act, which enabled the establishment of this inquiry, makes it clear that the duty and the task of this inquiry is, as we all know, to make findings on the likelihood of the upcoming elections being free and fair. But we say that this is to be done with the purpose of assisting the Commission in achieving free and fair elections. We submit further that the purpose of this investigation cannot be understood in any other way as to firstly attempt to help ensure free and fair elections within the constitutionally determined outer limit of 1 November 2021, given that this inquiry is of course also bound by the Constitution. We are not, Justice, of the view that some hold and which you this week described that come hell or high water we must have these elections. But nonetheless, we submit that the regularity of our elections was built into the foundations of our Constitution by design and not by accident. It is of fundamental importance to do everything possible to adhere to the requirement that municipal councils should be replaced by way of an election before 1 November. We agree that it's also non-negotiable that these elections must be free and fair.